We're going to learn about law and order, because that's a big theme of the parasha this week. Shoiftim v'shoitrim, that we have an instruction to set up courts and to set up policing. And the truth of the matter is that that's not something that was limited to biblical times or ancient times. It's a responsibility that we have across history. We've got to make sure that there's law and order. So we're going to learn a midrash that is very intriguing on this topic of law and order, because when you hear the midrash, straight away you're going to have, I'm sure, you're going to have at least one or two very important questions. And it's those questions that we're going to have to try and unpack over the next few days. Because, let's start, before we go to the midrash, just start with a simple question. How important do you think it is to have laws in a society, or to have systems that could firstly quantify those laws and then, of course, enforce those laws? How important do you think that is? It's fundamental, right? It's absolutely vital. Can't have a functional society without law and order. I think everybody accepts that, right? Okay. Now, next question. Seeing as we live in such a law-abiding part of the world, so, it's a little difficult when you live, for example, if you look at the traffic rules, which are on paper in this country, they don't really exist in practice. So after you've driven in this country for a while and you go somewhere else to drive, it's actually a little bit painful. You have to abide by the speed limit. You can't cut across solid lines on the road. You've got to stop at the red. There's things that eventually you don't become, you get unused to them. Let's be honest. When everybody's driving like Meshugoyim, eventually you also drive like a Meshugana. You use it to your advantage. I'm a law-abiding citizen, but in this country, this law is optional. So that raises another question. Everybody acknowledges that rules and law and order are essential to the running of a society, to the successful, civilization. The question is, do we enjoy the laws? I mean, do we ever sometimes feel that's a bit meshuga? Why does that have to be the rule? It's impractical. There's some people, for example, you go to the Autobahn in Germany, the concept of speed limits, it's optional. You choose your speed. Why do we have to have this arbitrary thing that says everybody has to conform to a particular speed limit? Okay, so there are many, many compelling reasons why that is. But it doesn't mean that I enjoy it.
Sorry, somebody's phone's shouting.
So, the same thing with stopping at the red. Of course it makes sense to stop at the red. But if it's late at night and there's no traffic, you're going to have like a whole philosophical debate, Do I have to stop at the red if it's late at night and there's no traffic? So we don't necessarily always love the laws, even though we respect the laws. So the question is this. Out of all of the different things that Judaism has to offer, and there are many things that Judaism has to offer. There's spirituality, there's community, there's culture, there's history, there's wisdom, there's philosophy, there's mysticism. Out of all of the things, what would you expect if you had to pick all of the various things of Judaism? What would you expect the one thing that Hashem is going to, in a sense, love or embrace more than all of the others? It's an interesting question, right? And I'm going to break it down one step further, and that is, even if we are going to speak about laws, which is the theme of this week, there are different kinds of laws. There is civil law, criminal law, and, in our case, religious law. So, which one do you think has higher priority in Hashem's world? The civic law or religious law? In other words, what do you think Hashem is more interested in? If you keep the speed limit, or you pay your taxes, or you keep Shabbos. Which one do you think Hashem loves more, right? Okay, so that's the introduction to the Midrash we're about to learn. The Midrash says as follows. There's a sage called Rebbe Levi. And Rebbe Levi says that Hashem, and it's obviously based on this week's parasha, Shoiftim v'shoitrim titen lecha b'chol she'orecha, that you should have established judges, which implies courts, and policemen, which implies the enforcement of the law, b'chol sha'arecha, in all your gates, which means in all your places. Says Rabbi Levi that Hashem said, out of all of the aspects of Judaism and conduct and morality, the only thing that I truly love is din. Din is laws. Law and order. You didn't see that coming, right? Let's be honest. We thought Hashem's going to say, the one thing I love is the Torah. Or the study of the Torah. Or maybe you think that Hashem's going to say, the one thing I love is Shabbos. Or the one thing that I love is when people show care and concern for each other. Or tzedakah. Surely we would have anticipated one of those. Rabbi Levi says that Hashem says, out of everything, the only thing I love is, not the thing I love the most, the only thing I love is din, is justice. Such a strange perspective. And then Rabbi Levi says, because it only gets better, then Rabbi Levi says that there's a parable that will illustrate what that means. So the parable is that there was a king. Okay, that's not a surprise. Usually when we use a parable to represent Hashem, it's going to be a parable of a king, for obvious reasons. But the minute you hear the parable, it no longer seems relevant that it should have to be a king. And yeah, the story is that there's a king. And the king had a few sons. And the king also had various fields, and he had orchards. And there was a particular orchard that was his favorite orchard. And there was a particular son that was his favorite son. Okay, we're not going to get into the whole debate about whether you should have favorite children or not. This is a parable. So he has a favorite son. Who's his favorite son? His youngest. What we call what do we call it in Yiddish? Amogenical, right? The youngest. So the king decides that he's going to take the orchard that he loves so much, he's going to give it to the child that he loves so much. Because, that's kind of the match. That's kind of the relationship. Says Rabbi Levi, in exactly the same way, Hashem says, out of everything that I gave to humanity, I love din, mishpat, the concept of law and order. I love that more than anything else. So I gave that to the Jewish people because the Torah tells us, Ki na'ar Yisrael va'oi havehu. The verse says that Israel is a child, is a youth, and I love him. In other words, that there's a special love, the special the relationship that Hashem has with his youngest child, so to speak, which is the Jewish nation. Therefore, he gave us mishpat, he gave us law and order. That's the Midrash. As I said, when you hear the Midrash, you're probably going to have a few questions. So do you have any questions? No? Okay. Let's ask a few questions. Firstly, the most obvious question. Did Hashem only give law and order to the Jewish people?
No.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We know.
Maybe he did.
What's that?
The way the world's going at the moment, maybe he did. We missed the plot.
So we know that there's something called the 7 Noah Chad laws, which are universal. They apply to every human on the planet. The 7 Noah Chad laws are 6 prohibitions and 1 instruction. What's the 1 instruction? Establish systems of law and order. It's the only positive mitzvah of the 7 Noah Chad laws. So how could Rabbi Levi suggest that Hashem gave law and order to the Jewish people as some kind of a special gift because he loves us and he loves law and order? What are you talking about? He gave law and order across the board. Every human being is supposed to take responsibility to ensure there's law and order in their environment. Every government is responsible, from a Torah perspective, is responsible to ensure that there's law and order. What do you mean? What are you claiming over here that it's given to the Jewish people? That's question number 1. Question number 2. If he wants to tell us a story, a parable, why do you ever tell parables? Why do you ever use metaphors?
To illustrate.
To illustrate. So I want to say, for example, let's say right now they're busy painting the shul. Do I need to use a parable to explain what painting a shul is? Once upon a time there was a king, and the king loved his house. And so he got somebody to come and to plant beautiful flowers in his house. And from this I learn that we're painting the shul. It doesn't make any sense. The whole reason you use a metaphor or a parable is because what you're trying to illustrate is not easy to understand. So you've got to make ease of access by using the parable. Because I'm talking about an abstract concept, so I need something that is relatable. Is it abstract to believe that you have somebody you love and you give them something that you feel is valuable? Do you need a parable for that? Just say simply, Hashem loves law and order. Hashem loves the Jewish people. Therefore he gave the Jewish people law and order. What do I need this whole story? It was a king, and he had fields, and he had orchards. How does it help me understand the concept any better? Next question. Is it only kings who sometimes love one child more than the other? No, it's human nature. We don't like to talk about it, right? But it happens. It happens frequently that you have somebody who has favorites on one of their children. So why does the parable have to be a parable of a king? Why can't it just simply be a father? That's what you're talking about. Talking about the relationship between a parent and a child, and the fact that there is a different relationship between the parent and this particular child. So, because hey, tell me a story. Once upon a time, there was a father. Okay, he happened to be a father, has a lot of wealth. So he had fields and he had orchards, whatever the case. Fine, because hate. Stop. There was once a father. Father had a child. This child he loved more than everything. He gave him whatever his most cherished possession was. Why'd I have to know that's a king?
So a king has stature,
Yes.
and a king can be related to Hashem.
Absolutely. King can be related to Hashem, but if I'm trying to illustrate the relationship between a parent and a child, saying that it's a king actually sounds like it's taking away from the relationship.
If it applies to a king, how much more will it apply to
Okay, fair enough. So let's say that okay. So is the objective of this parable to illustrate that it could apply to other scenarios? Or is the objective of this parable to tell me about this relationship? Because that's what the parable surely is looking to illustrate, right? And then in this relationship between the king and the child, that the king favors this particular child and therefore gives what? Okay, so how much more so might apply to others? It's true, but why is it relevant to this particular parable? So why do I have to know that it's a king? Okay? Next question. Why? There's obviously something over here about this love between Hashem and din, between Hashem and the concept. See the painting. It's clearly. So there's obviously, we're trying to illustrate how much Hashem loves law and order. But let's be honest. Is it accurate to say that Hashem loves law and order more than anything else? Well, let's put it slightly differently. If you wanted to look for the differentiator of being Jewish compared to being something else, would you say, you know what distinguishes Jews from the rest of the world? We have law and order. Would you say that? You can never say that. A chutzpah to say that. We don't have the rights to disregard the rest of the world who have systems. Yes, of course, the laws may differ from place to place, but they have systems. They have law and order. How could we dare to say that what distinguishes Jews from the rest of the world, we have law and order? Nonsense. Everybody has law and order. So surely if you wanted to identify the differentiator of the Jewish people, you should have said, we have mitzvahs. The rest of the world is not expected to keep Shabbos, or to only eat kosher, or to wear tzitzis and tefillin, or put mezuzahs on their doors. Those are uniquely Jewish experiences. I had such a funny thing yesterday. I was at somebody's office putting up mezuzahs. So the idea was that there are a number of Jewish employees. So we're going to put mezuzahs on the doors of the Jewish employees' offices. But you don't have to impose a mezuzah on the doors of other people. It's not their thing. It's not their mitzvah. It's not their requirement. So it felt very strange. It was almost like mocking the Jews. in the office.
Sure.
It was like a weird experience.
Yeah.
Right? A little bit like the Pesach story, where they had to put blood on their doorposts. It was that kind of an experience. So if you're looking for a distinguishing aspect of Jewish people, surely the distinguishing aspect is mitzvahs, not law and order. Law and order should be universal. Why is this parable in the Midrash focused that somehow, because Hashem loves us, He gave us law and order, which does not seem to be the case? And by the same token, what do you mean Hashem loves law and order more than anything else? Where did we get that concept from? I mean, I'll give you an example. The Gemara tells us, I'm sure you remember, if not all the details, you remember the gist of this Gemara. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us that when Hashem wanted to give the Torah, so Moshe comes up onto Mount Sinai, and the angels are very alarmed. Why is there a human being in heaven? This is a breach of security. How could this happen? So they say, what's going on over here? And Hashem says, no, He's come to get the Torah. So the Gemara records that the angels, their response was, this is the treasure that you have cherished for so many generations, and now you're going to give it to the people, to the humans. Rather leave it in heaven. And King David alludes to this in Tehillim, where he says, Tena hoitcha ala shamayim. Hashem, place your glory on the heavens. In other words, leave the Torah, which is your glory in the heavens. Now you read that story. What do you think is the most cherished, beloved thing that Hashem has? Torah. The Torah. The angels didn't say, don't give humans law and order. The angels said to the contrary, humans need very heavy law and order because they're impossible. That's why we don't want them to have the Torah, because they don't know how to look after the Torah. So from their perspective, and based on the verse in Tehillim, it sounds like Torah is Hashem's cherished treasure, not law per se. So why is this Midrash telling us that Hashem loves more than anything else? He loves the concept of din or mishpat, the concept of laws. And then the final question is, somehow we want to illustrate that there's a special relationship that Hashem has with us. And because of that special relationship, He gave us din and mishpat. He gave us these processes of law and order. In the case, why is it necessary to tell us specifically that the Jewish people are compared to a youth? Surely it's enough just to say we're compared to a child, Hashem's child, regardless of the age of that child. Surely the relationship between a parent and a child is a very special, and very deep, and very meaningful relationship under all circumstances, at all stages of life, at all ages of life. What's the emphasis over here on the fact that it is the story of a child? Okay, so these are the questions that we have to try and unpack. And the reason it's so valuable is because we have to understand, what role does law and order play in our lives? None of us sitting around this table are in the legal profession. So we don't have this responsibility to enforce law and order or to design law and order. We don't do that. Our job is to follow the laws, right? So it doesn't really seem to be something that talks to us in any very meaningful way. So we've got to try and understand and appreciate what's going on over here. So we're going to wrap up today with the clue. The clue will give you something to think about. So that tomorrow we can come back and solve the mystery. Okay, here's the clue. When the sages use metaphors, they obviously choose the words very carefully, and you can see that in the fact that we're analyzing why it has to be a king, and we're analyzing why the Jewish people have to be compared to a young child, because obviously every aspect of the parable is very carefully chosen. So one of the aspects of the parable that's really significant is the fact that he gives the child an orchard. So a vineyard and an orchard might be very similar in this regard. The question is, why is it an orchard and not a field? So that's going to be our clue. That the particular metaphor over here is emphasizing the concept of an orchard versus the concept of a field. So let's unpack this clue a little bit and try and work out what is the difference between the purpose of a field and the purpose of an orchard, or the produce of a field versus the produce of an orchard. Because with that information, we'll have our clue. So let's try and work it out. What's the big difference between a field and an orchard?
Answer today, we've got to wait for tomorrow.
No, I'm saying this we want to unpack now, so then we have a clue that we could work
I would
with.
say an orchard is ready-made.
An orchard is ready. What do you mean ready-made?
A field, you got to go and graft the thing. You got to plant
Good
and
point.
till and
An orchard.
Good
an
point.
Orchard,
all you
to
got to
to
do
your
is
point. An orchard,
Yeah.
you just have to harvest every year.
That's
You got to
it.
pick.
You harvest once
Okay.
a
All
year.
you go, you need to send your
A
shop and
field,
pick
you
the
got to
oranges.
plow, you got to sow seed,
Yeah.
and then you got to leave it to lie fallow for 7 years after the 7th year, so that it can revive.
Okay,
the
so
whole
that's a good observation, is that there's a lot more work that is associated with
field.
a field versus an orchard. True. Well, that would make a lot of sense then, because if you're talking about the child that you love, you want to give him an easier time.
Ready-made.
Right,
Come
ready-made.
into the business.
Perfect. Any other difference between a field and an orchard? It doesn't necessarily have to be the difference between the field and the orchard. It could be the difference between the produce of the field and the orchard. Okay, so here's the big clue. You ready? Here comes the big clue. A field is usually associated with grain. Usually. You think of a field, in those days, they were producing wheat. An orchard, as you've identified, is associated with fruit. The big difference between grain and fruit: grain is a staple. Grain is essential for survival. Fruit is a luxury. Now, that would also then make sense why he's giving the orchard to the favorite child, because he wants him to have that luxury of fruit. In those days, before they had all the nonsense that we have, all the ice cream and the chvesos, fruit was your luxury item. So that's our clue. The difference between a field and an orchard is the difference between a staple, vital food versus a luxury, pleasurable food. So with that clue, maybe we'll start to unpack what's going on here.